Today, we are going to talk about a man who was such a Chad that he created tornadoes every time he farted. Every time this Chad sneezes, he caused earthquakes. This man's Chadly aura is like a black hole consuming the very fabric of time and space, and simply resisting it was a futile effort. This man was such a Chad, if you poured lemon juice on his open wounds, he would say, "More, please." Today's episode of Chads of History is about Genghis Khan. Originally named Temujin, it is debated whether he was born in 1155 AD, or 1162, or even 1167. So yeah, there's almost 12 years of guesswork in between those dates. But legend has it that his birth brought good tidings as he came into this world holding a clot of blood in his little baby hand. When Temujin was 9 years old, his father Yasuge had been poisoned by a bunch of Tartars, or another nomadic group at the time. So now, with the head of their clan dead, the rest of his people are now being led by a rival family called the Techuit. So Yasuge's widow and her kids had been abandoned by the remainder of their old clan, and for a while they had to survive and live off the land. Well, apparently he had been captured by the Techuit, and instead of outright killing him, they wanted to make him a weird pet thing by putting a wooden collar around his neck and kept him around the camps for some reason. Well, being the keen-eyed, youthful Chad at the time, he noticed his captors sucked at guarding him. So he knocked out the sentry guarding him and ran for the hills. The only person who had witnessed him escape thought it was such a cool idea of him escaping, he decided to help him. Alright, so now Temujin and his family have a little bit of prestige left over from when they were royal members of the Borjigan clan. He even managed to get his wife back that his dad betrothed him right before he died. Okay, so there's this group of people called the Merkit, and they lived in northern Mongolia. And they fucking hated Temujin because his dad Yasuge had stolen his wife from one of their men. They had gotten payback by stealing and doing horrible things to Temujin's wife Borte. So yeah, there's that. So there's this guy named Togrul, and he was the Khan of the Kurite tribe, and he had been best buddies with Temujin's dad. He also just happened to be the strongest Khan of the land. So Temujin asked him for help to get his wife Borte back. So Temujin gave him some kind of skin as a gift, and Togrul helped him in reuniting his scattered peoples. I would assume Temujin got his wife back. Oh yeah, apparently this Togrul dude gave Temujin a whole army as well, at some point, so that's pretty cool. So Temujin has beaten the Merkit with the help of his allies and made it a point to never allow room for future rebellion. He absolutely refused to have an enemy near his rear and would make sure nobody could betray him before he went on to his next target. So he essentially wiped out the nomadic leaders that opposed him. So now, after destroying the Merkit, he basically treated another clan, the Jurchen, in a similar way, except these people were supposed to be allies, but had plundered Temujin's property while he fought the Tartars, so he proceeded to exterminate them like the treacherous vermin they were, but then took in all the commoners as soldiers, workers, etc. Fun fact, the Tartars are called that because a 13th century scribe heard a description of Mongolian nomads secondhand and described them as a detestable nation of Satan that poured out like devils from Tartarus, so that they are rightly called Tartars. To which Tartarus is just an old word for hell. Anyway, now Temujin was strong enough to take on the Tartars and beat them in battle. He then proceeded to slaughter everyone who was taller than the height of a cart axle. Short kings everywhere celebrated. But he mostly did this because the kids were young enough to likely not remember their past and would be easier to assimilate down the line. So now things are starting to get uneasy between Temujin and his old buddy Togrul of the Kurite, and their alliance had broken down at last. Well, knowing that Temujin doesn't like to leave loose ends, he had no other choice but to dispose of his old ally. He then took in their people as servants and soldiers. It may come across as cruel doing this, because it is, but Temujin's reasoning was that he didn't want to leave anyone of the old aristocracy alive who could provide him any resistance later down the line. Now, in 1206, Temujin was generally accepted as the emperor of all the steppe peoples. He was also allied with a person named Jamuka, but then that dissolved after a disagreement about where they should set up camp. And after that, Temujin's wife Borte told Jamuka to fuck off. So they all went their separate ways. It's also known that most of Jamuka's men left him to join up with Temujin, as they could see the writing on the walls, and kind of knew if it came down to it, Temujin would break his foot off in Jamuka's ass, So this had kind of created a divide amongst the Mongolian people, and clan leaders had began to pick sides. So there had been coalitions formed by Jamuka, but they were swiftly crushed, and the Tartars had been decimated. The Mongols utilized their sturdy, agile horses along with their compound bows. So Togrul, being the easily influenced sheep he was, allowed himself to be swayed by Jamuka and his goals. Togrul's son also had high ambitions, and this led to a full-fledged war against Temujin. So needless to say, Togrul and his Kurite people were killed. Then, this Naiman ruler from the west formed another coalition with Jamuka, but they both got their asses handed to them at the Battle of Chakirmaut. At some point during the battle, Jamuka had retreated the battlefield, basically leveling the playing field for both sides. The Naiman ruler, Taiyang Khan, was attacked at the flanks, and eventually formed a defensive square to defend against it. But they were essentially surrounded on all sides and were picked apart and lost a lot of men, and eventually the battle. Then, Jamuka deserted the Naiman Khan, and now there was essentially nobody left to contest Temujin's rule. Jamuka was shortly betrayed and captured by his own men, and was given the option to join Temujin's army or die. But for Jamuka, if he couldn't live life as a Chad, he didn't want to live at all. So he was executed. So later that year, they held an assembly where Temujin was named Genghis Khan. Alright, so the year is 1206 and the Mongols are ready to spread their wings and start harassing the rest of the world. Genghis Khan had created a unified Mongolia and was ready to conquer the rest of the world. Initially, Genghis Khan's armies consisted of almost exclusively cavalry, with heavy lancers to light horse archers, which was good at fighting other nomads, who also had a bunch of cavalry and horse archers, but not very good at taking cities. So he learned in the ways of the siege, and began to utilize mangonels, which to me seems like a catapult and a trebuchet had a baby, and that's what came out. But he even used burning oils and resorted to diverting rivers. So now, after a while of interacting with other nations and other more settled states, Genghis Khan is starting to realize there's more to life than just pillaging and destroying villages. A minister of the Naiman Khan, the last group resisting Genghis Khan, basically showed him the importance of literacy and why it is important to be able to read. So now, in 1209, Genghis Khan is turning his attention to China and took control of the northwestern border state of China belonging to the Tangut Kingdom of Xia, or Western Xia. They had even requested assistance from the Jin Empire, but their emperor, Wanyan Yongji, basically said, "We don't like you, why would we help you?" They essentially considered them enemies. Genghis Khan then defeated an army led by Guo Lianghui outside of their city, and proceeded to take Wulahai, and continued down the Yellow River. He reached a fortress called Clemen, which guarded the only way through the Helen Mountains, which would take him straight to Western Xia's capital, Yinchuan. So he besieged the fortress, but they were too heavily defended. So Genghis Khan faked a retreat, and then, when the garrison force came out of the fortress, he backhanded them back into the Shadow Realm. So Yinchuan had about 150,000 soldiers, which was almost twice as much as Genghis Khan had. So this is where he put his big brain to work by diverting the river to flood the city. But that backfired when the dike diverting it broke. This did, however, help him in taking the city, as he managed to destroy all of their crops. So with no reinforcements or food, the city surrendered and submitted to Mongolian rule. Their leader, Li Anquan, even gave his daughter Chaka to Genghis to prove his newfound loyalty. He then attacked the Jin Empire in northern China, but was paid a huge amount of booty for temporary peace. He then resumed his conquest a year later and eventually took Beijing. So now he controls northern China. Genghis Khan wants to turn his attention to the Khwarezm people. This war had been started by a governor of the city Otrar, where he had a caravan of Muslim merchants massacred, and this caravan also just happened to be under the protection of Genghis Khan. So now, in 1217, before he left to go on this escapade, he asked his newly vassalized Western Xians to assist him, but they didn't, and Genghis besieged their capital again as a warning, and then left to fight the Khwarezmian dynasty in 1219. So I assume the Mongols asked them for help again, as the information says they refused to help them again during the Khwarezmian campaign, and Genghis Khan had sworn vengeance. It was this war that the Mongolians had earned their brutal reputation of slaughter and savagery. So he beat the Khwarezmians in 1221, and the Mongols had stormed city after city, either slaughtering the inhabitants or making them serve as soldiers. He only led his armies one more time in the final campaign against Western Xia in 1225. He had remembered that he still has some revenge to dish out to Western Xia. So with about 180,000 men, he attacked in full force, taking Karakoto and continued south. So there's this new guy who's the military commander of Western Xia, and the only name I can find for him is Asha. So now, with Genghis Khan marching south, Asha knew he couldn't take Genghis Khan's force in a regular battle because that required them to walk through 310.7 miles of scorching desert. So Genghis didn't have any booty readily to kick, so he attacked city to city. He began taking prisoners, recruiting more soldiers, and taking supplies, and grew with each taken city. By this point, Genghis was getting really peeved because Western Xia didn't submit already, and were putting up a pretty strong resistance. So Genghis resorted to total war, basically destroying the countrysides, garrisons, and cities until he could get that dastardly Asha to face him. So Genghis then laid siege to Suzhou and then took Gansu, where he had a general named Chagan who had this dad, who was the commander of the city garrison. So he tried to use daddy's favor to negotiate and surrender peacefully, but I guess the city hates peace because they staged a coup, killing that general's dad instead of negotiating with him. So Genghis got his revenge, took the city after 5 months, and killed about 35 conspirators responsible for Chagan's dad's death. Alright, so now Genghis and his army had just taken Liangchao and proceeded to besiege another city, Lingwu, which was about 18 miles away from their capital, Yinchuan. So now fast forward a little bit to the Battle of Yellow River, where Western Xia led a counterattack with about 300,000 soldiers. They fought near the frozen riverbanks, and the Mongols gave them a thorough ass-kicking. So now he has reached Yinchuan and began to siege the city, all the while preparing for another war against the Jin dynasty because he wasn't satiated from the amount of warring previously. He had also sent his son, Ogadai, and Chagan to threaten the Jin and possibly force negotiations. Meanwhile, Genghis was back in Western Xia and besieged the capital for about 6 months. He was also directing the siege of Longde at the same time. Chagan had also returned to report that the emperor of the Jin dynasty was willing to make a deal, but needed some time to save up for some really cool presents for Genghis, to which he agreed, because who doesn't like presents? The only issue is, Genghis kind of secretly planned to kill him. So now, near Goyan, the Jin had sent another peace offer, to which now Genghis is telling to piss off, because who else is he going to fight? He had prepared to invade the Jin near their border, but in August 1227, Genghis Khan died of unknown causes. This would have been a big blow to their campaign if the enemy found out. So they kept it a secret. At least until Emperor Maozu surrendered in September of 1227. He was then executed. So in their act of revenge, the Mongolians proceeded to pillage and raze Yinchuan and slaughtered almost all the civilians, and plundered all of their tombs, temples, and treasures. And even after Genghis Khan's death, he kept his promise to the Western Xians. Alright guys, well that's been Bandana Man with another Chads of History video. If you're a Chad yourself, please like the video, subscribe, and feel free to leave me some comments. But only Chadly comments. Just kidding. Anyway, you guys be easy. Bandana Man out.